The Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. I must say I'm somewhat surprised to be standing at so early a stage in the second reading. But nevertheless, it has to be said at the very outset that the structure of the bill, the way it is presented, all of it makes perfect sense, and ordinarily I would not be giving any issues, any thoughts, any concerns. However, looking closely at the bill, and as someone who has been involved in managing medical affairs in a number of facilities in Western Australia and in other states, I have come across APRA in a way which I doubt anyone else in this chamber has. So you could then say I have particular experience in the situation regarding the guardian of the healthcare services. It is a vital service. The monitoring, the registration of health practitioners throughout Australia is an essential service for very obvious reasons, and maintaining the standards for very obvious reasons. And we do demand of such an organisation the very highest of standards, the very highest of experience, and the very highest of service to both patients and the health professions. So on that basis, it's a good bill. But I have to tell you, I shall be, at the end of this second reading debate, I shall be actually voting against this and calling for a division, because I do require that it be clearly documented that there are substantial issues which have not been addressed. And they have not been addressed because the people who are addressing the issues have not got primary contact with the actual problems, and those who have made it have been advised by those with less close personal results. Now, we're looking here at a system of managing a very complex service, of managing the very complex situations which can occur in the multitude of contacts between healthcare professionals and people seeking help. It must also be said that the healthcare profession is a very conservative profession. Now, I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the attitude that we need to be aware that the actions that we take, the advice we give, needs to be on solid ground. We need to have proven approaches which are of benefit to our patients and do not put them at unnecessary risk. It could be said that every time I cut someone or put something into a person's body or offer a tablet, I am actually opening the possibility of a risk occurring. For example, it could be that you have a particular reaction to, say, a medication for rheumatoid arthritis, and you end up then with an aplastic anemia and dying of a form of bone marrow failure. It's possible. In fact, if you go to America and listen to the television, which I highly recommend you do not do, you will often find advertisements there suggesting fairly heavy medication, and the burble that comes at the end suggesting, yeah, consult with your doctor may result in death. And that's very, very true, because we have in the States, we have the number 3 or 4 cause of death is reported to be properly prescribed medication, properly administered, and that amounts to some 120,000 annual deaths. And in Australia, we're going to get a similar number of deaths. In fact, we also have the sad reality that when doctors go on strike, the death rate seems to fall, and that is somewhat of a surprise. And that is despite our conservative approach to medical treatment. Now, let me refer back to the good old days, back to 1890-something, and a conservative society. We're looking here at the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Semmelweis, Ignaz Semmelweis in Austria, who proposed at that time there might be a particular cause for young women dying in childbirth, the so-called puerperal fever. Now, in those days, of course, because we're a conservative society, and then, as now, advertising is forbidden, the only way you could propose that you were a good doctor was by how many patients chose to see you. The more popular you were, the better the doctor you were. And so they'd take off their top hat and their frock coat, and they'd put on the kittel, the white coat, And after a procedure, say lancing a boil, which is very frequent there, they'd wipe their hands on that, and then they'd move to the next patient. And another procedure with blood there, perhaps, and they'd wipe their hands. And so the dirtier the front of your dress coat was, the better the doctor you were. You can imagine the filth on the hands. And then they would go to the hospital, maternity hospital, and a woman would be freshly delivered of a baby, and they'd have to do an internal examination to prove that everything was well with the young lady. And of course, the inoculation of an immense amount of bacteria resulted in sepsis and death. Now, Semmelweis proposed that Lister in Scotland might have an idea by offering carbolic soap to wash the hands, and that might be a good idea. And he was hounded. Semmelweis was hounded out of medical society because he proposed an outlandish theory. In fact, he died shortly thereafter in a lunatic asylum because the colleague treating him infected him with his hands, and he died of sepsis. That's very ironic. Now, that same level of conservatism, we're going to do what we've done before because we've always done it that way. Do what Dad did, do what Grandad did. We'll carry on doing it in the future because this is a safe way of doing it, which allowed, I think, in the not too distant past in Western Australia, a certain doctor called Barry Marshall to be almost struck off for proposing that it's possible that Helicobacter might be associated with gastric ulcers. And in fact, he took a sample of that himself to provoke an ulcer and treated it, and won Nobel Prize later. And the threats of having his career extinguished by APRA were vanishing. There's a pattern there. And I'll speak more of this a little bit later. But the conservative nature there is to protect our patients, and that's a wise thing to do. I notice in the legislation here that the main focus is protecting patients, not protecting the health staff. And I note that one of the ways of actually helping us to identify those who are falling short is by the patient or a relative giving what's called a notification to APRA. Now, notification is much like giving a one-star referral review for a bed and breakfast. Bad thing has happened, here's my report, off it goes to APRA, you sit back and you wait for action to happen. Now, the figures I have got is about 80,000, I think, of that order, applications for notifications went in. I think 1.6% proceeded, thereabouts. The figures may be a bit odd, but of that level, not a great number. However, the fact of the matter is that these notifications automatically demand that the healthcare practitioner have this noted. And there is the assumption that the notification is equal to guilt until proved otherwise. You can understand the pressure on all healthcare practitioners. I, for myself, for example, have had to report when I was looking for a locum job that I was under examination by APRA, and therefore I was assumed to be guilty of unprofessional standards. And so I was refused the option of having a locum to earn the extra cash because I was assumed to be guilty and I hadn't yet been proved innocent. And what was the accusation? The accusation was that I stopped a beta blocker in a patient with asthma. Now, the problem with that is beta blockers in the presence of asthma result in sudden death, and it's not a good idea to mix the two. But the person putting the notification in basically wanted to cause me trouble, and did, very successfully. So for a year or so, I was under the assumption of guilt, when in fact what I was doing was helping to save a patient's life. Another area where we're looking at this is in the APRA, and I've come across this very recently, is that the actual problem is that doctors in Australia do not actually swear an oath to Hippocrates, the old-fashioned primum nil nocere, and apologies to Hansard, first do no harm. It's a primary oath that we have to swear, or at least believe in. Now, I have actually sworn that oath. I've taken that oath. First, do no harm. Now, obviously, there are two ways of causing harm. I can take a knife in a well-meaning attempt to cut someone, cut an artery, and I may not be able to stop the bleeding, and they may die. That's possible. I have caused actual harm by being unprofessional, by being unhelpful with the way I've manipulated a dangerous tool, and a patient has died. The second way I can cause harm is by not doing something. I see something on the skin, and I think that needs to come out, but I don't want to cut an artery. I'll leave that, see how it goes, and he gets a skin cancer spreading, and he dies as a result. So I've caused harm by doing nothing. And that, you see, is, you must bear this in mind. Bear in mind the idea that if we are not going to do something, we'll sit back and just, we'll observe and just see how it goes, that we may, in fact, be causing harm by doing nothing. Bear that in mind. It will come up later. Now, we've all got the excellent example of how APRA worked in Queensland, for example, with the horrible case of Dr. Patel, a surgeon who was uniquely incompetent and had caused a huge amount of pain and suffering to people under his knife. Now, that's excellent. This is really one major reason why APRA is there, to recognise where things have gone wrong and taken the excellent step of making sure this person does not put patients in Australia at risk again, ever, and indeed report to other countries if he works elsewhere. This report will follow him. Beware, he is not competent. It wasn't the fastest process, but it was a thorough process. That's right. However, we've all heard recently of the problems with Dr. Teo, a neurosurgeon who has been given great grief from APRA because he operated on cases which technically weren't operable. A chance was given, maybe a small chance. And when a complaint was made that the operation, kind of a Hail Mary operation, didn't work, he was then given the blame because he wasn't actually following the peer response. Most people said, we're not going to do anything. But he said, listen, I'll give you a chance, I will do that. And for that, he was hounded, given extreme grief. Although the attempt was there, with the risk explained, this is a last-ditch attempt. And still, he has been persecuted, if you like. That may be one extreme case. Let me take one which is less extreme. I'm not sure if you remember some years back a Tasmanian cardiologist, Dr. Fetke. Dr. Fetke had thought that patients presenting with cardiac issues might, in fact, might prevent further cardiac problems, hardening of the coronary arteries, if they were to have a reasonable diet. Let's avoid, if you like, an unhealthy diet. Let's have the recommended cardiological low-fat diet, get the LDL below 1.4, take the statins, don't have too many carbohydrates, the approach here of eating a healthy food. He was actually held responsible in APRA for having overstepped the boundaries of his profession. He was not a dietitian, he was a cardiologist. And they were going to take his licence off him for not abiding by the limits of a cardiologist. Now, you might think this is entirely idiotic, and I would thoroughly agree with you. Every part of a medical consult should involve how do I nourish myself well, because nutrition is one of the major conditions, the major influences which have an effect on your wellness. And indeed, there are cardiologists who have gone entirely that way of let's do nutrition and exercise to prevent the cardiac disease happening in the first place. A, it's better for the patient, and B, it saves an awful lot of money to the patient and to the community. But no, APRA took the part of the group which was protesting and said, you shouldn't be doing this because you're just a cardiologist. Now, it turns out that the people asking for him to be punished was, in fact, the dietitians who thought they might be losing trade. And this was only uncovered when, I think it was in New South Wales, or it might have been the Victorian tribunal from the Parliament, hauled APRA in front of them. Tedious process. And even then, the answers they gave were avoiding the question, putting the blame elsewhere, absolving themselves of any particular responsibility. No one was actually held to account for having caused an eminent doctor to possibly lose his licence because of vested interests which had been hidden from the public. That troubles me greatly, because it also has an effect on doctors. Now, if we have that vested interests are going to have be skewed against you, if we're going to have an approach there which is not actually challengeable, then doctors are going to keep their heads down. This is a sensible thing to do. In fact, if you ask doctors now how they're going to manage with, say, advice about COVID, everyone that I've come across is going to keep their heads down. They don't want to put their heads above the parapet in case they get targeted. And then the consequences are really quite severe.
Order, members. Noting the time, I'm going to interrupt debate.